In 1451, an Italian named Christopher Columbus was born in Genoa, Italy. There is no exact timeline of when Columbus picked up the idea of what made him famous to this day, the idea to cross from Spain to the Indies. There is not much known about Columbus's early life, which has often caused many to speculate that is if he was even born in Italy in the first place. He picked up the idea from the ancient philosopher Aristotle, who asserted that you could cross from Spain to the Indies in comparatively a few days. Columbus contended that there was a faster route to the Indies than by going through land or completely around the Horn of Africa. The ancient philosopher Strabo recorded that several Greeks and Romans had tried to make this journey but failed. He also picked up concepts from medieval authors in books such as Piero de alle Imago Mundi, a book called Imago Mundi, and Pope Pius II, Historiam Rerum Ubli Gerastrum. Apologize for the poor pronunciation. The numerous guesses about the narrowness of the ocean, Columbus also took inspiration from the Bible's Psalms. He shall have dominion from sea to sea and from river unto the ends of the earth. Columbus was indeed a very religious man and a very pious Catholic. Columbus spent a great deal of time in Portugal. This is where he led many voyages to the torrid zone in Guinea. He made a proposal for a trip westward that was declined by King John of Portugal, of whom some historiographers have speculated that he was related. By 1492, he made his way to Spain, where he was ready to make an amazing proposal to King Ferdinand II, a proposal that would lead to one of the greatest discoveries in the history of the world. This is a podcast which will cover the history of the global 7 Years' War, including the conflict in the Americas, also known as the French and Indian War, as well as the conflict in India. To do so properly, we will need to take a look at the events which led up to the conflict. The first will be about the European discovery of America and the long wars of the 17th century. Don't forget to subscribe to our Patreon page, listed in the link below. We will post plenty of bonus content, maps, and sources which will be available for everyone. Columbus made his guess on the length of the earth based on medieval and ancient authors who had speculated about the subject. His mistake was a mistranslation of the author Tuscanelli. He misunderstood the translation calculating the distance from Japan to the Canaries, which Columbus had drastically reduced. The total calculation by Tuscanelli was around 5,000 miles. But Columbus had reduced it to around 3,550. The true distance from Spain to China, however, is going west, that is, about 10,000 miles. But this did not stop Columbus from his wishful thinking. There was a general interest, not just by the Spanish, but all European powers were hoping to find a path to the Indies for trade and spices. At the end of the 15th century, it was nearly impossible to reach Asia from Europe by land. The route was long and arduous and encountered with hostile armies that were difficult to avoid. Portuguese explorers solved this problem by taking to the sea. They sailed south along the West African coast and around the Cape of Good Hope. After Columbus made his proposal to King Ferdinand of Spain, he agreed to support Columbus in his potential journey. The little fleet left on August 3, 1492. The admiral's navigational genius showed itself immediately, for they sailed southward to the Canary Islands off the northwest of the African mainland, rather than sailing due west to the islands of the Azores. The westerlies prevailing in the Azores had defeated previous attempts to sail to the west, but in the Canaries the three ships could pick up the northeast trade winds. Supposedly, they could trust the westerlies for their return. After nearly a month in the Canaries, the ship set out from San Sebastian de la Gomera on September 6th. On several occasions in late September, Several members of the crew spotted floating vegetation and several types of birds, all taking as sign that land was nearby. But by October 10th, the crew had begun to lose patience, complaining that with their failure to make landfall, contrary to winds and shortages of provisions that would keep them from returning home. Columbus tried to reduce their fears, at least temporarily, although he seemed to have a mutiny on his hands. But on October 12th, land was sighted from the Pinta. The place of first Caribbean landfall is hotly disputed, but San Salvador in the Bahamas is generally thought to be the first place where Columbus landed. There they met the native Arawak they encountered, and they thought of Columbus as a god or a deity. They would soon find out that would not be the case. Of the native Arawaks he encountered there, Columbus wrote in his diary, "They were well built, with good bodies, handsome features. They do not bear arms, and they do not know them. For I showed them my sword. They took it by the edge and cut themselves out of ignorance. They have no iron. Their spears are made of cane. They would make fine servants. With 50 men, we could subjugate them and make them do whatever we want." Beyond planting the royal banner, Columbus spent little time there, being anxious to press on to Sapingo, or Japan, where he thought he was going. Of course, he was nowhere near there. He thought that he had found it in Cuba, where he landed on October 28th, 1492, but he convinced himself by November 1st that Cuba was the Cathay mainland itself, though he had yet to see any evidence of the great city. Thus, on November 5th, he turned back southeastward to search for the fabled city of Zaytlan, or modern-day Guangzhou in China. Missing through this decision was his sole chance of setting foot on Florida soil, which he narrowly missed. Adverse winds carried the fleet to an island called Ati, or Haiti, by its Taino inhabitants. On December 6, Columbus renamed the island La Isla Española, or Hispaniola. He seems to have thought Hispaniola might be Cipango, Japan, or if not Cipango, Japan, then perhaps one of the legendary rich islands for which King Solomon's triennial fleet brought back gold, gems, and spices to Jerusalem. Alternatively, he reasoned that the island could be related to the biblical kingdoms of Sheba. There Columbus found at least enough gold and prosperity to save himself from ridicule on his return to Spain. With the help of Tano, or the Indian chief, named, sorry for this pronunciation, Gangari, he set up a stockade on the northeast coast of the island and named it La Navidad, and posted 39 men to guard until his return. The accidental running aground of the Santa Maria on Christmas Day, 1492, provided additional planks and provisions for the garrisons. Columbus then returned to Spain, telling the king and queen what he had found. About 6 months later, in September 1493, Columbus returned to the Americas on his second voyage. Columbus established a settlement named La Isabela on an island he called Hispaniola in present-day Haiti. He enslaved thousands more of the Arawak there, working many to death in a futile attempt to extract gold from the ground that contained but scant amounts of the metal. He sent 500 slaves back to Spain. 200 perished on the journey. Undeterred, he wrote, "Let us in the name of the Holy Trinity go on sending all the slaves that can be sold." Then he headed west, continue his most fruitless search for gold and other goods. His group now included a large number of indigenous people the Europeans had enslaved. In lieu of the material riches he had promised the Spanish monarchs, he sent some 500 enslaved people to Queen Isabella. But the queen was horrified. She believed that any people Columbus discovered were Spanish subjects who could not be enslaved, and she sternly sent or returned the explorer's gift. In May 1498, Columbus sailed west across the Atlantic for the third time. He visited Trinidad and the South American mainland before returning to the ill-fated Hispaniola settlement. The colonists had staged a bloody revolt against Columbus's brothers Bartholomew. Mismanagement and brutality. The conditions were so bad that the Spanish authorities had to send a new governor to take over. Meanwhile, the native Taino population, forced to search for gold and to work on plantations, was decimated. Within 60 years after Columbus landed, only a few hundred of what may have been 25,000 Taino were left on their island. For Columbus's actions, he was arrested and returned to Spain in chains. The king and queen were shocked when they learned that the admiral had been humiliated and sent home in shackles. They had Columbus and his brothers released, but they also appointed Nicolas de Ovonto to replace Columbus as governor. Ovonto sailed to Hispaniola with 30 ships and approximately 2,500 colonists, soldiers, and sailors. In 1502, cleared of the most serious charges, but stripped of his noble titles, the aging Columbus persuaded the Spanish crown to pay for one more trip across the Atlantic, still hoping to reach the ill-fated China or to reach Asia. This time, Columbus made it all the way to Panama, just miles from the Pacific Ocean, where he had to abandon 2 of his 4 ships after damage from storms and hostile natives. A revolt forced him from his leadership. He returned to Spain empty-handed, where he died in 1506, never knowing, or never understanding at least, the full scale of what he had discovered. He was not fully given credit for his discovery until 100 years later. In fact, the name America comes from the explorer Amerigo Vespucci, who founded the islands of Brazil, or founded Brazil, modern-day Brazil, and found the Amazon. But his discovery is overshadowed by his behavior and poor rule as governor of the colony. But undoubtedly, the European discovery of America is one of the most important turning points in history, which would slowly pull the world away from the feudalist model of governance to the modern capitalist one, which still exists to this day. On November 10th, 1483, a German by the name of Martin Luther was born in Elsben of the Saxony electorate. Martin Luther would go on to be one of history's most significant figures. Luther spent his early years in relative anonymity as a monk and scholar. But in 1517, Luther penned a document attacking the Catholic Church's corrupt practices of selling indulgences to absolve sin. His 95 Theses propounded 2 central beliefs: that the Bible is the central religious authority, and that humans may reach salvation only by their faith and not by their deeds. This was to spark what would be known as the Protestant Reformation. Although these ideas had been advanced before, Martin Luther proposed them at a time in history ripe for religious reformation. The Catholic Church was ever divided, and the Protestantism that soon emerged was shaped by Luther's ideas. His writings changed the course of religious and cultural history and brought Europe, and would eventually bring Europe, into a global war. Religious tensions remained strong throughout the second half of the 16th century. The Peace of Augsburg, signed under Charles V, Emperor of the Holy Roman Empire, in 1555, began to unravel. Some converted bishops refused to give up their bishoprics, and certain Habsburgs and other Catholic rulers of the Holy Roman Empire in Spain sought to restore the power of Catholicism in the region. Ferdinand II, educated by the Jesuits, was a staunch Catholic who wanted to impose religious uniformity on his lands. This made him highly unpopular in Protestant Bohemia. The population's sentiments notwithstanding, the added insult of the nobility rejected of Ferdinand, who had been elected Bohemian crown prince in 1617. This would trigger the 30 Years' War in 1618 when his representatives were thrown out of a window and seriously injured in the so-called Defenestration of Prague. This provoked an open revolt in Bohemia, which had powerful allies. Immediately after the Defenestration, the Protestant estates and the Catholic Habsburg started gathering allies for war. After the death of Mathis in 1619, Ferdinand was elected Holy Roman Emperor. At the same time, the Bohemian estates deposed Ferdinand as King of Bohemia and replaced him with Frederick V, who was the Elector of the Palatinate and a leading Calvinist and the son-in-law of the Protestant King James I of England. After the Defenestration of Prague and the ensuing Bohemian Revolt, the Protestant electors of Bohemia, Brandenburg, and the Palatinate formed the Protestant League, while the Catholic Habsburgs, with control of Austria, Spain, and the Bavarian electorate, formed the Catholic League. Because they deposed a properly chosen king, the Protestants could not gather international support they needed for the war. Just 2 years after the Defenestration of Prague, Ferdinand and the Catholics regained power of Bohemia at the Battle of White Mountain on November 8, 1620. This became known as the First Battle in the 30 Years' War. In 1623, at the Battle of Stoutlon, the Catholic forces under the Count of Tilly crushed the Protestant forces led by Duke Christian of Brunswick. After this catastrophe, Frederick V, already in exile in The Hague and under growing pressure from his father-in-law, James I, to end his involvement in the war, was forced to abandon any hope of launching any further campaigns. It seemed as though the Protestant rebellion had been crushed. Frederick was forced to sign an armistice with the Holy Roman Emperor Ferdinand II, thus ending what is known as the Bohemian phase of the 30 Years' War. Peace following the imperial victory at Stoutlon proved short-lived, with the conflict resuming at the initiation of Denmark. Danish involvement began when Christian IV of Denmark, a Lutheran, who also ruled as Duke of Holstein, a duchy within the Holy Roman Empire, helped Lutheran rulers of the neighboring Lower Saxony by leading an army against Ferdinand II's imperial forces in 1625. Denmark had feared that the recent Catholic successes threatened its sovereignty as a Protestant nation. The Danish entry into the war proved an abject failure for the Protestants. The Catholics under the Count of Tilly led major victories and put the Catholic Habsburg rulers of Spain and Austria at the height of their power. After this Catholic victory, Ferdinand declared an Edict of Restitution, which forced Protestants to return to the Roman Catholic Church all property seized since 1552, revealing to the German princes the threat of imperial absolutism. Their opposition forced Ferdinand in 1630 to dismiss Wallenstein, the mainstay of his power. This only forced further opposition in the Nordic Protestant states, as soon Sweden would enter the war, under the leadership of King Gustavus Adolphus. Gustavus landed in Germany without allies. Whatever the feelings of the Protestant populations, the Protestant princes resented Swedish interference into the war, and the refusal of George William of Brandenburg to cooperate with the Swedes thwarted Gustavus's attempt to save Magdeburg from capture and sack at the hands of Tilly's army. But as Frederick of Prussia, a man who will become very important in our story, would later write in his Memoirs of the House of Brandenburg, he would show that Gustavus Adolphus forced the Elector of Brandenburg, George William, to support his cause by saying there would be no neutral states in this war. Also in September 1631, John George of Saxony, or Beer George, as he was known, was provoked by violations of his neutrality, formally allied himself with Sweden. In September 1631, at Bredenfeld, the Swedish Saxon forces shattered General Tilly's Catholic army in a battle. In the ensuing months, Gustavus swept triumphantly through central Germany, systematically consolidating his bases in areas as he advanced. By Christmas of 1631, he had established himself at Mainz, and it seemed that the fate of the Holy Roman Emperor lay in his hand. The main Catholic field army was destroyed, and the Swedish Protestant hosts overran most of central Germany and Bohemia in the winter of 1631. The next summer, they occupied Bavaria. They won a great victory at the Battle of Lutzen in November 1632. Although the king of Sweden, Gustavus Adolphus, died in battle. He was replaced by his chief advisor, Axel Oxenstern. Sorry for that pronunciation. And Sweden then continued the war in Germany. In the east, Sweden managed to engineer a Russian invasion of Poland in the autumn of 1632 that tied down the forces of both powers for almost 2 years. Meanwhile, in Germany, Oxenstierna crafted a military alliance that transferred much of the cost of war onto the shoulder of the German Protestant states at the Helbron League on April 23, 1633. Swedish ascendancy, however, was destroyed in 1634 when Russia made peace with Poland at Polyanov, and Spain sent a large army across the Alps from Lombardy to join the Imperial Catholic forces at the Battle of Nördlingen, September 6th. This time the Swedes were decisively beaten and were obliged to withdraw their forces in haste from most of southern Germany. On May 30th, 1635, the Peace of Prague was signed, which ended Saxony's participation in the 30 Years' War and brought France on the other side of the conflict. Within a year, most other German Lutherans also changed their allegiance from Stockholm to Sweden. After the Peace of Prague, the nature of the 30 Years' War was changed dramatically. Instead of being principally a struggle between the emperor and his own subject with some foreign aid, it became a war of the emperor against foreign powers, whose German supporters were at most times few in number and limited in resources. On November 2nd, 1642, the Habsburg army was routed in Saxony at the Second Battle of Breitenfeld. The emperor was saved from further defeat only by the outbreak of a war between Denmark and Sweden, which lasted between May 1643 and August 1645. Yet before Denmark's final surrender, the Swedes were back in Bohemia and at Jankovic. March 6th, 1645, they totally destroyed another Catholic army. So in 1645 and 1646, with the aid of French and Swedish mediation, the territorial rulers were granted a degree of sovereignty. A general amnesty was issued to all German princes. An eighth electorate was created for the son of Frederick V, Maximilian I, and he possessed a coveted dignity. The Edict of Restitution was finally abandoned, and Calvinism within the empire was granted official toleration. The Peace of Westphalia was signed in October 1648 in the Westphalian cities of Osnabrück and Munster. This finally ended what was to be known as the 30 Years' War. The 30 Years' War permanently broke any hope of a permanent peace in the Holy Roman Empire. Although religion was the origin of the conflict, the outcome would play a huge role in the following century of geopolitics and the wars which were to follow. Compared with the chaos unleashed by the 30 Years' War on the European continent, the British Isles under King Charles I enjoyed a relative peace and economic prosperity during the 1630s. However, by the later 1630s, Charles's regime had become unpopular across a broad front throughout his kingdoms. During the period of his personal rule, known by his political enemies as the 11-Year Tyranny, because he had dissolved Parliament and ruled by decree, Charles also implemented a series of unprecedented taxes. One notorious example, called the ship tax. A tax was intended for coastal cities, but was carried out throughout the kingdom. But it was religious laws which became the origin of the civil wars on the British Isles. In 1637, King Charles introduced a modified version of the English Book of Common Prayer that provoked a wave of riots in Scotland, which began at the Church of St. Giles in Edinburgh. The Scottish Presbyterians were vehemently opposed, as it was in violation of their Presbyterian religion to use the Book of Common Prayer. A national covenant calling for the immediate withdrawal of the prayer book was speedily drawn up, and on February 28, 1638, the so-called Bishops' Wars began, and this eventually brought the conflict between king and parliament and the parliamentarians to a head. The king needed money, and the parliamentarians held a large majority of the capital. The parliamentarians, such as the Earl of Warwick and John Pym, had been leading critics of the king during the 11-year tyranny. The turn of events in Scotland horrified Charles, who was determined to bring the rebellious Scots to heel. However, the Covenanters, as the Scottish rebels soon became known, quickly overwhelmed the poorly trained English army, forcing the king to sign a peace treaty at Berwick in 1639. Though the Covenanters had won the First Bishops' War, Charles again refused to concede victory and called an English Parliament, seeing as it was the only way to raise money quickly. On November 3rd, 1640, the Parliament called for the punishment of the Earl of Strafford, who was King Charles I's close political aide and was essentially the scapegoat for Charles I's unpopularity. The lengthy trial at Westminster ended with Strafford's execution in May 1641. The king was then forced to sign the death warrant of his close friend and political ally Strafford, an action for which he never forgave himself. But in 1641, the Irish Rebellion began. The Irish Catholics were rebelling against English Protestant rule under the old O'Neill clan. And at Portadown in Northern Ireland, 1641, about 100 Protestants were massacred by the Irish Catholic forces. Now, Portadown was undoubtedly an example of a great massacre of the Protestant English settlers, but exaggerated reports soon got back to England about the situation in Ireland. The Irish insurrection immediately precipitated a political crisis in England, as Charles and his Westminster Parliament argued over which of them should control the army to be raised to quell the Irish insurgents. Had Charles accepted the list of grievances presented to him by Parliament in the Grand Remonstrance of December 1641 and somehow reconciled their differences, the revolt in Ireland almost certainly would have been quashed with relative ease. Instead, Charles mobilized for war on his own and thought the Parliament's demands were simply unacceptable, eventually raising his own standard at Nottingham in August 1642. The battle lines were soon drawn for the English Civil War. In the summer of 1642, the king's supporters in Parliament, many of whom had been former parliamentarians who were drawn away from the Puritan cause away from the radical Puritan cause, and the king's allies gathered around him in Oxford. On the night of October 22nd, the two nearly even forces discovered that they lay only a few miles apart, and the following day, the first battle began. The Royalists were commanded by Prince Rupert, son of the Winter King Frederick of the Palatinate, who you might remember started the 30 Years' War in Germany. And the parliamentarians were headed by Robert Devereux, the Earl of Essex. The first battle, known as the Battle of Edgehill, was indecisive, but was the first battle of the English Civil War. The parliamentarians held control of the south, and the Royalists held control of the north. The parliamentarians, however, were able to make a deal with the Scots, bringing them into the conflict on their side in the winter of 1643. They flexed their advantage in the summer of 1644. The parliamentarians, under the lead of Lord Thomas Fairfax, and the Royalists, under the lead of Prince Rupert, met at Marston Moor, just 7 miles from York. The Battle of Marston Moor, as it would be known, would be the decisive battle in the First English Civil War. Both sides had about 7,000 in cavalry, but the 11,000 Royalist infantry were easily outnumbered by the 20,000 combined parliamentarian and Scottish infantry. At the Battle of Marston Moor, it was the right wing of the parliamentarian army headed by a man named Oliver Cromwell, who will be very important later in our story, pushed back the Royalist forces significantly. Cromwell then met up with Sir Thomas Fairfax and attacked the Royalist army from the rear. The Battle of Marston Moor became a decisive parliamentarian victory. The parliamentarians finished the job off at Naseby in 1645. Some saw the conflict as a way of achieving radical political, social, and religious change, including groups such as the Levellers and the Diggers, many of whom served in the parliamentarian army. Radical soldiers' views were expressed at the Putiny debates of 1647. This was a series of discussions about the future constitution of Britain. But the conflict would again resume on November 8, 1648, when Charles I escaped from Hampton Court and began to negotiate with the Scots to gain their support for a new continued campaign against Parliament with the aid of the Scots. To buy the support of the Scots, Charles I agreed that English should have a 3-year period of Presbyterianism. By the end of December 1647, any hope of an agreement between Charles and Parliament had ended, and plans were put in place for the Scottish invasion of England. The fighting then resumed at Preston, which was a particularly vicious battle. As a result of this, those who had volunteered to fight for Hamilton and surrendered were harshly treated. They were sent as virtual slaves to the plantations of Barbados and Virginia. The parliamentarians again won a decisive victory. Those conscripted in Hamilton's army were sent home. The royalist cause was lost. Charles had no support in Scotland, and his power base for what it was, in Wales and Ireland, was virtually non-existent. In 1649, the trial was held for King Charles I at Westminster. Charles was convicted of treason and executed on January 30th, 1649, outside the banqueting house in Whitehall. After the execution of Charles I, a radically democratic group known as the Levellers began a rebellion against the New Model Army and the Commonwealth, claiming that the leaders of the New Model Army were becoming kingly themselves. Oliver Cromwell and the New Model Army crushed the rebellion amongst its ranks. The Commonwealth then faced a rebellion from the other side of the political spectrum. The Scots and Presbyterians rallied around King Charles I's son and heir, Charles II, and proclaimed him King of England and Scotland. After which many parliamentarians were wanting to invade Scotland once again and end the threat. But Sir Thomas Fairfax, who was the head of the newly formed New Model Army, had enough of the war and was against another preemptive attack against the Scots. Fairfax was eventually forced to retire, and Oliver Cromwell took full command of the army and served as the first chairman of the Council of State. The British Isles were then declared a republic and named the Commonwealth. Work against the barbarous and bloodthirsty Irish. He chose an assault on Drogheda, north of Dublin. Drogheda, located on the River Boyne, was well fortified by a wall which surrounded it. Its defenses were led by Sir Arthur Ashton with 3,000 royalists. But Oliver Cromwell had 8,000 troops, called his Ironsides, disciplined, daring, fanatically Puritan, and hated Catholicism. They were also very skilled with the artillery of the time, which easily breached the fortified walls of Drogheda. After which, the New Model Army pillaged and showed no mercy on the Irish Catholic population. Cromwell, who was a radical Puritan, hated the Irish Papist and thought this type of terror was necessary to teach the Irish a lesson. He then won a great victory at Wexford in the south of Ireland, then returned home to fight the Scots once again. On July 22nd, the New Model Army, under Oliver Cromwell, invaded Scotland. The Scots, commanded by David Leslie, retreated to Edinburgh and refused battle. After a month of maneuvering, Cromwell unexpectedly led the English army out of Dunbar in a night attack on the 3rd of September and heavily defeated the Scots. The survivors abandoned Edinburgh and withdrew to the strategic bottleneck of Stirling. The English secured their hold over southern Scotland, but were unable to advance past Stirling. On July 17, 1651, the English crossed the Firth of Forth in specially constructed boats and defeated the Scots at the Battle of Inverkeith on July 20th. This cut off the Scottish army at Stirling from its sources, supply, and reinforcement. Charles II, believing that the only alternative was surrender, invaded England in August. Cromwell pursued, and the few Englishmen rallied to the royalist cause. Charles II, believing that the only alternative was surrender, invaded England in August 1651. Cromwell pursued, and a few Englishmen rallied to the royalist cause. Cromwell brought the badly outnumbered Scots to the Battle of Worcester on the 3rd of September and completely defeated them. this marking the end of the Wars of the Three Kingdoms in England. From 1649 to 1660, England was therefore known as a republic. During the period known as the Interregnum period, the English Republic, as it was known, was a series of political experiments as the country's rulers tried to redefine and establish a workable constitution without a monarchy. Throughout the period known as the Interregnum, Oliver Cromwell's relationship with Parliament was a troubled one, with tensions over the nature of the Constitution and the issue of supremacy, control of the armed forces, and much debate over religious toleration. Much of the English population became frustrated with Parliament for their inability to pass significant legislation. They had also started the Anglo-Dutch wars by passing legislation which did not allow Dutch ships to pass through their English ports. The army became more and more discontent with Parliament. It believed that the members were corrupt and that the new Parliament should be called. Once again, Cromwell tried to mediate between the two antagonists, but his sympathies were with his soldiers. When he finally came to the conclusion that Parliament must be dissolved and replaced, he called in his musketeers and on April 20th, 1653, expelled the members from the House. He asserted that they were corrupt and unjust men and scandalous to the profession of the gospel. 2 months later, he set up a nominated assembly to take their place. In a speech on July 4th, he told the new members that they must be just and ruling in the fear of God, to resolve the affairs of the nation. Cromwell wanted to end the naval wars against the Dutch. In December 1653, after a coup d'etat planned by General John Lambert and his other officers, the majority of the Assembly of States surrendered power into Cromwell's hands. He decided to take them up on that offer, albeit reluctantly. As the commander-in-chief appointed by Parliament, he believed he was the only legally constituted authority left. He therefore accepted as an instrument of government drawn up by Lambert and his fellow officers. He became Lord Protector, refusing to take the crown, thus leaving England for the first time without a king since the time of Alfred the Great. Ruling the three nations of England, Scotland, and Ireland, with the advice and help of the Council of State and Parliament, which had to be called every 3 years. Despite resistance from some members of his council, Cromwell allowed Jews into the country. Cromwell founded a college at Durham and saw to it that grammar schools flourished as they had never done before. He was also the head of the Oxford University during this period. As Lord Protector, Cromwell was much more tolerant than in his fiery Puritan youth. Once bishops were abolished and congregations were allowed to choose their own minister, he was satisfied. Outside the church, he permitted all Christians to practice their own religion so long as they did not create disorder and unrest. He allowed the use of the Book of Common Prayer, what had started the conflict in the first place, in private houses, and even the English Roman Catholics were better off under the Protectorate than they had been before. In 1654, Cromwell brought about a satisfactory conclusion to the Anglo-Dutch War. As a contest between fellow Protestants, he had always not liked the prospect of going to war with the Dutch. The question then arose of how to best employ his army and navy. His Council of State was divided, but eventually he resolved to conclude an alliance with France against Spain. As to the Constitution, though, nothing could be done in a satisfactory manner. Cromwell insisted they must accept the 4 fundamentals of the new Constitution that he argued had been approved by both God and the people of these nations. The 4 fundamentals were government by a single person and Parliament. The regular summoning of parliaments, which must not be allowed to perpetuate themselves, the maintenance of liberty of conscience. Richard Cromwell, Oliver's firstborn son, was appointed to the Committee of Trade in 1655, but he showed little of his father's ability. And it was not until 1657, when a new constitution gave Oliver the right to choose his successor, that the Lord Protector began to groom his son for high office. Richard succeeded his father as Chancellor of Oxford University. He became a member of the Council of State on December 31st, and about the same time he obtained a regiment and a seat in Oliver's House of Lords. On his deathbed, Oliver designated Richard as his successor. Oliver died on September 3rd, 1658, and Richard was immediately proclaimed Lord Protector. In addition to the conflict between Parliament and the army, caused the army to establish a council to plot its strategy. When Parliament forbade the council to meet without Richard's permission, the council seized power and forced Richard to dissolve Parliament. The officers now were called the Rump Parliament, which had been dissolved by Oliver in 1653. The Rump dismissed Richard, and on May 25th, he officially abdicated. The Parliament brought back the old king, or not king, Charles II, the king in waiting, who had been in France. He was proclaimed King of England, thus ending the English interregnum period and restoring the Stuart monarchy to the throne of England. But, as we will see in the next episode, this was not to last. If you enjoyed the episode, don't forget to subscribe to our Patreon page, where we will upload tons of bonus content, maps, sources, and other bonus features for subscribers. Bye.